let's talk about the optimal omega ratio. So the typical diet today is 16 to 1. And this is, what are we referring to? We're talking about omega 6-3 ratio. So this would refer to omega 6, the 16, and then the 1 would refer to omega 3. Okay, so the most diets today, for pound for pound, right, you get 16 to every 1 omega 3. And this right here, it's this balance that leads to a heightened inflammation. Your body makes more inflammation than what is necessary to do the daily maintenance. And so everything is becoming a struggle. And let me give you another analogy. So when you have this ratio, imagine you're tearing down old homes in a neighborhood because they're full of termites and they're full of mold, and these homes are unlivable, right? And they have to go so that you can build new homes. Okay, think of homes as we think of your cells. You've got old cells, they need to go. Generally, you would use, to tear down old homes, you would use something like a bulldozer, right? You'd use a tool like a bulldozer. And that would be the appropriate tool to tear down an old home, okay? And in your body, you would use a tool like a balance of omega 6 to omega 3. So the balance of 6 to 3 is akin to like using a bulldozer, right? But instead of using a bulldozer, now imagine that you're using a 20-ton bomb. And that bomb, that huge bomb like that, is not just going to blow up the house that you're trying to tear down, but it's going to blow up the whole neighborhood around it. And so you're going to have this big mess, and maybe the whole neighborhood didn't need to be blown up. Maybe it was just the one house. My point is, you use the right tool to do the right job, and when your ratios are 16 to 1, it's like using a 20-ton bomb to replace an old cell, and what happens is not just that one cell that gets damaged and taken back, it's lots of exaggerated damage that occurs, and so now your body is using more inflammation than what's necessary to break down the old to replace it with the new. So it's breaking down the new as it's breaking down the old and creating more work and more repair. And this is where inflammation becomes chronic. This is where inflammation levels go up and they become very, very chronic and hard to manage. So if you're following kind of a standard American diet, 16 to 1, in some cases I see it much higher. Like in a lot of the people that I see that come to me, we'll see 20 to 1. We'll see 25 and 30 to 1 ratios of omega 3s and 6s. The target is 4 to 1. Most researchers agree 4 to 1 is a much better place to have, again, taking the analogy into consideration, a bulldozer-like effect. I preferentially, with people that are struggling with chronic illness, I actually look at 2 to 1 or 1 to 1, if we can achieve it, as being more ideal. And that's because when somebody's already got fires burning out of control, we really want to get it dialed back. Now, this 1-to-1 ratio actually has historical significance, and this is actually where, if you've ever heard of the paleo diet or followed a paleo diet, as a general rule of thumb, a true paleo diet is about a 1-to-1 ratio. So, there's historical significance here in this, and that we as humans today are not all that far removed from, historically timeline speaking, from Paleolithic ancestry. And so some argue that this 1-to-1 is actually more ideal because we haven't had enough time in society to evolve to a bigger ratio. But I've seen it possible at 2-to-1 ratios, and I've seen perfectly healthy people with 4-to-1 ratios as well. But we certainly, think of this as the ideal, no higher than this, and you definitely don't want to be here because this is where you're going to get a heightened inflammatory response. So let's talk about some of the symptoms. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is some of the more common kind of clinical manifestation that we see. One is skin issues, so like recurring skin rashes, and this can look like eczema. So if you've ever been diagnosed with eczema, you might consider asking your doctor to test your omega-3 fatty acid ratios in your red blood cell membranes. It's a simple test. It's a simple blood test. It can help you understand whether or not you have a deficiency. But again, skin issues, particularly eczema, a very common manifestation of omega-3 fatty acid deficiency. Another one can be depression, especially this one's particularly with DHA. So again, we said this is omega-3, not just omega fatty acids. This is omega-3 specifically, not omega-6. But DHA, this is more has to do with EPA, right? Again, these are the two different subtypes of omega-3 fatty acids. And then dry eyes and vision distortion and vision problems, and this is again where we see a lot of DHA issues. In my experience, generally when somebody is deficient in omega-3, they're deficient in both. It's not like one is great and the other one's terrible. They're generally deficient in both, although I'll sometimes see cases where people are supplementing with an omega-3 fatty acid supplement that's high in DHA but very low in EPA, and they just don't know enough about the supplement to understand that they're creating good levels here, but not really addressing levels here. So when you're, again, going back to supplementation, you always want to look that supplement contains both EPA and DHA, not just one or the other. You need them both. So these are some pretty common signs of deficiency. There's some research, especially in infants, that suggests that low levels of EPA, DHA, or more specifically even focused on DHA, contribute to poorer IQ or learning or cognitive disabilities as kids evolve, as their minds and brains mature. So there's also research that shows that omega-3 or EPA specifically is very, very important for regulation of cardiovascular risk factors like triglycerides. I mentioned earlier that people with high triglycerides are oftentimes deficient in EPA, and that can be a cause of high triglycerides. We also see, again, super high levels of LDL develop as a result of EPA deficiency. So again, sometimes and this is even true, and some cardiologists will actually prescribe, they'll give RX prescription omega-3. They've actually, some pharmaceutical companies have latched onto this and have actually created pharmaceuticals that are designed to help with cardiovascular risk by elevating omega-3. The problem that I have seen with some of the pharmaceutical brands is they're full of dyes and other fillers. So the quality and the attention to detail in the products, in my opinion, is poor, as it is with many drugs that contain fillers that are unhealthy for us. A lot of drugs contain fillers. Let's talk about some gluten, grain-free food sources of omega-3. So predominantly omega-3, think cold water fish, right, as I've been saying for a while now. Salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovy, cod, halibut, all good sources. Algae is a plant-based source. Flaxseed, walnuts, chia seeds, some leafy greens as well, but not substantially so, which is why it didn't make the main list. You're not going to get enough from leafy greens to really hit the need that a person's going to have. So these are your primary sources. And how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you love these foods? I mean, it's very rare to see people in today's society really gravitate toward eating fish. You know, a couple pounds of fish a week is about what it would take to get you really solid levels. And most people don't even come anywhere near that. So then you're left to these devices, the walnuts, the chia seed, the flaxseed. But many people going gluten-free struggle with seeds. That's why if you are following No Grain, No Pain, you know, that struggle is that seeds are hard to digest, and when your gut's already damaged by years of gluten exposure and damage, throwing in a bunch of seeds into the diet will sometimes delay or hinder a person's progress because the gut's already broken and you're asking it to digest things that are hard to digest. And so these are not always the greatest sources either. So fatty fish is our predominant source. Now you can get some omega-3 as well from grass-fed beef, but the issue here is it needs to be grass-fed, grass-finished, because what a lot of farms have done is they call it grass-fed beef, but then they finish it out on grain. And you understand that when you feed a cow, when you feed an animal tons of grain, what does that do to the flesh of the animal? Well, it converts the type of fat in the animal's flesh into omega-6. So if you're eating grass-fed, grain-finished, you're going to get more omega-6 from that beef. If you're eating grass-fed, grass-finished, you're going to get more omega-3 from that beef. So it's an important delineation to make, because if you're not asking that question, I've seen cases where they just call it grass-fed beef, but they don't delineate whether it was grass-finished. Well, grass-fed just means I fed my cow some grass. There's no legal requirement on a label for a farmer to say to differentiate. So you've got to know the source of your food, and you've got to ask the company or the manufacturer what you're actually getting there. It's very important delineation. And then we have omega-6, and I said earlier, and these are what we would generally consider to be relatively healthy sources of omega-6, but most omega-6 in the American diet comes from grains. All grains contain high quantities of omega-6. Remember, in the U.S., 50%, calorically, 50% of calories in the U.S. diet comes from wheat, which is horrific, right? Which is just it's an omega-6 bomb. And that's why omega-6 oftentimes referred to as bad, because it's such an imbalance. There's so much grain in the diet, driving up omega-6 to such a great degree that you don't get the regulatory process of regulating inflammation properly. You get this huge imbalance, and so you get heightened inflammation as a result of that. Some of these are healthier versions or healthier sources of omega-6. But, one thing I would also add, we could put in here, is chicken or other poultry. And the reason why, unlike beef, ruminant animals are not designed to process or digest grains. Like their guts are not designed for grain as a staple food. They're more designed for grazing of grasses, but not necessarily the seeds in mass quantities. And so what happens on these commercial farms is you lock all these animals in tight quarters, and the only thing they get to eat is grain. They don't get any natural grasses or clovers or other greens, and that's what they need to be healthy. Chickens, on the other hand, can eat grain. Ruminant animals, not so much. They're not quite designed for it, but chickens are. They're designed for seeds. They're designed to be able to handle that. But the problem with chicken today is when you buy chicken, you want to look for the term free range. And I recommend, when you buy your meats, I recommend, if you don't have a great local farmers market where you can talk to the farmer directly, there are certain companies that I do recommend. You can find those recommendations on glutenfreesociety.org. Under the shop tab, there's a section called Food Resources, and you can find those different companies that we do recommend there. We'll put a link to that. But you want a true free range. So what free range means in the industry is that they're all inside and the door's open. That's not free range. You want chickens actually grazing on pasture, grazing and eating bugs and insects and picking at worms. Because the chicken diet should also not be predominantly just grain, but chickens can eat grain. And again, a lot of people get scared. They think, oh, if I eat chicken, then I'm going to get gluten. No, the gluten won't show up in the meat of a chicken or the egg of a chicken. And chickens are capable of eating and processing grain, but they should be true free range, so their diet is more diverse. Because how you get good solid, you can get omega-6 and omega-3 from chicken if they're truly free range. But where people run into trouble with chicken is when they're not free range and they're just grain fed. This is where, just like with the beef, you're going to get a lot of omega-6 in that meat. It's going to drive up your omega-6, and if you're not getting adequate omega-3, that ratio that we don't want to see happen, which is that 16-to-1, really anything higher than 4-to-1, is going to lead to a challenge with regulating the inflammatory process. So just, again, when you're checking your meats, check for, again, organic, free range, because it's the other thing. Organic, because if they are eating grains, if the farmers are feeding them some grains in their feed, you want to make sure they're not getting pesticide in that grain. So you don't want glyphosate in your meat. You don't want glyphosate in your eggs. So again, it's important that you look for organic, free range, but we could add chicken to this list as well. And then omega-9s, as we talked about earlier, olive oil, olives, avocados, olive oil, almonds, sesame oil, pistachios, cashews, hazelnuts, and macadamia nuts. So a lot of different ways we can get omega-9s in the diet. And remember, I took time earlier to draw out how omega-9 regulates the permeability of the cell, of that phospholipid bilayer of your cell. So very, very important for hormonal messaging. This is a very common deficiency I see when we test people. Most people I see are deficient in omega-3. I'd venture to say of all new people that come to me in my clinic, I'd say probably 90% coming in from the get-go are omega-3 deficient. And I'd say probably 30% are omega-9 deficient. And so these are quite common to see out there. And it's very easy through diet to achieve adequate levels. But again, if you're telling yourself I hate fish, it's going to be a real tough challenge to get enough omega-3 in, and this is really where supplementation is recommended in a big way. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below, and as always, thanks for tuning in.